Welcome. Before we step into this disturbing and heartbreaking true story, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from and make sure you subscribe, because an incredible amount of research and careful fact-finding goes into bringing these forgotten histories to light. What you're about to hear isn't just shocking, it challenges everything people thought they knew about power, secrecy, and cruelty during slavery. This is the story of an enslaved woman forced into repeated childbirth, and a pattern so disturbing that even those who benefited from it tried to hide the truth. She was born into bondage, not knowing a single day of her life, without ownership stamped onto her existence. Her real name was never recorded in any ledger that survived, only replaced by a shortened version the plantation used for convenience, stripping even her identity down to something manageable. From childhood, she belonged to the land, to the house, to the will of others. By the time she reached womanhood, her body was already seen not as human, but as property with a purpose. On that plantation, enslaved women were valued not for their thoughts or feelings, but for how much labor they could endure and how many children they could produce. From an early age, she learned that silence was survival, and obedience was the only shield against cruelty that had no limits. She worked primarily in the big house, which meant her suffering was quieter, but no less brutal. She cleaned floors until her hands cracked and bled, washed linens stained with the private lives of people who denied her humanity, and stood motionless for hours, waiting to be ordered. The master's family saw her every day, yet never truly saw her. To them, she was part of the furniture, present, useful, replaceable. But what made her different from the others was her youth, her health, and what they coldly referred to as strong stock. That phrase followed her like a curse, whispered between overseers and written casually into plantation records, sealing her fate long before she understood what it meant. Her life changed the first time she was summoned late at night. There was no explanation, no choice, no escape. What happened was never spoken of directly, not by her and not by those who did it. On plantations like this, silence protected the powerful and buried the powerless. When she became pregnant the first time, there was no celebration, no concern for her health, only calculation. Another child meant more property. Another body meant more labor. She was barely more than a girl when she gave birth, alone except for an older enslaved woman who had learned long ago not to ask questions that could get both of them killed. That first child marked the beginning of a pattern that would define her entire life. From the outside, she appeared calm, obedient, almost invisible. But inside, she was trapped in a cycle of fear and exhaustion that never ended. Her body was never given time to heal. As soon as one pregnancy ended, another followed. There were no years between births, only months of pain, recovery, and forced continuation. Her health deteriorated slowly, chronic weakness, constant bleeding, and pain that never fully went away. Yet she was never spared, never excused, never treated as fragile. To the plantation, her suffering was irrelevant. Despite everything, she formed quiet bonds with the other enslaved women. They helped her when they could, sharing food, watching her children when she collapsed from exhaustion, whispering prayers over her at night. They saw what was happening even before the pattern became impossible to ignore. They noticed the fear in her eyes whenever footsteps approached after dark. They noticed how she flinched at voices that sounded too familiar, but none of them could intervene. On a plantation ruled by violence, even concern was dangerous. Her children were taken from her almost as soon as they could walk. Some were sent to the fields, others sold off, quietly, their names erased before they were old enough to remember her face. Each loss hollowed her further. She was expected to keep working, keep producing, keep surviving, as if motherhood were nothing more than a function. Love was a liability. Grief was weakness. And yet, she loved them anyway, knowing that loving them meant losing them. What made her situation even more isolating was that she lived close to the master's family, close enough to observe their laughter, their meals, their children growing up protected and adored. She watched children who shared her children's faces grow up free, educated, and valued, while hers were beaten into obedience or sold like livestock. That contrast carved something deep inside her, a quiet understanding that the world she lived in was built on deliberate cruelty, not ignorance. As the years passed, her youth faded, replaced by a tired resilience that came from enduring the unbearable. Her posture changed. Her eyes grew distant. People later described her as hollow or ghost-like, as if part of her had already left this world. But she kept breathing. She kept waking up. She kept surviving, not because she wanted to, but because survival was the only form of resistance left to her. By the time people began whispering about the number of children she had borne, she was no longer shocked by anything. Her life had become a pattern of endurance without hope. She existed in a space where pain was normal and injustice was routine. And yet, without ever being asked, without ever being given a choice, she became the center of a story so disturbing that even those who benefited from her suffering would later try to erase it. But before the world noticed the pattern, before questions were asked, before rumors spread, there was simply a woman, enslaved, silenced, and trapped, whose life had been reduced to a function, and whose humanity was denied at every turn. The master's household was built on appearances, polite manners, Sunday church visits, and the carefully maintained image of respectability that Southern plantation families worked hard to project. From the outside, it looked like order and refinement. Inside, it was a place of unspoken secrets, quiet arrangements, and power that operated without question. The master was a man obsessed with control, not just over land and labor, but over people's bodies and silence. His authority was absolute, and everyone under his roof, enslaved or free, understood that his will was law. Living with him was his younger brother, a man who, on paper, held no official power over the plantation, yet exercised influence in ways that were far more dangerous. The brother had arrived years earlier, supposedly to help manage affairs, but he stayed far longer than expected. Unlike the master, he was not married, not bound by public responsibility, and not concerned with reputation. He moved freely through the house and quarters, watched without shame, and spoke with a familiarity that made others uneasy. The enslaved people noticed immediately that his presence changed the atmosphere. Where the master ruled with cold calculation, the brother carried something unpredictable, impulse mixed with entitlement. The resemblance between the two men was striking. Same build, same facial structure, same dark eyes. To strangers, they could be mistaken for one another at a distance. That similarity would later become the root of whispers, but in the early days, it was simply a curiosity. To the enslaved woman, however, that resemblance became a source of constant fear. She learned quickly to distinguish their footsteps, their voices, the way each man entered a room. One brought authority, the other brought dread. The household operated on rigid routines. Enslaved women assigned to the big house were expected to be invisible, present enough to serve, absent enough to be ignored. But the brother refused to ignore her. His attention was not subtle. It lingered, followed, and returned night after night. In a place where refusal was impossible, attention itself was a threat. She understood that whatever happened behind closed doors would never be acknowledged publicly, and that any consequence would fall solely on her. The master knew more than he ever admitted. He was not blind to what was happening in his own house, but he chose convenience over confrontation. The brother was family blood, someone whose presence he tolerated because it served his interests. There was an unspoken agreement between them, never discussed openly, never written down, but enforced through silence. The enslaved woman was not seen as a victim within that arrangement. She was a resource, and resources were to be used. As time passed, the household adapted to the situation in quiet, disturbing ways. Rooms were reassigned. Certain paths through the house became off limits to her after dark. Orders were given indirectly, through looks and gestures rather than words. Everything was designed to maintain normalcy on the surface, while allowing abuse to continue undisturbed. The mistress of the house either did not know or chose not to know. In a society built on denial, not knowing was often an act of survival. When the first child was born and the resemblance became undeniable, tension crept into the household like a slow poison. The master noticed it immediately. Others noticed it too, the shape of the eyes, the curve of the mouth, the way the child's face mirrored not him, but his brother. No one said anything out loud. They didn't need to. The truth sat heavy in the room every time the baby was brought into the light. The brother reacted differently. There was no visible guilt, no fear, only a strange sense of ownership. He looked at the child not with concern, but with recognition, as if seeing proof of something he believed he was entitled to. His presence around the enslaved woman increased after that. He acted bolder, less careful. It was as if the birth confirmed what he had always assumed, that consequences did not apply to him. The master, meanwhile, responded by tightening control. He ordered discretion, silence, and separation when possible. The child was rarely shown to visitors. Explanations were prepared in advance. Any enslaved person who spoke out of turn was punished swiftly, not necessarily for what they said, but as a warning to others. The household closed ranks, protecting itself from scandal while allowing the pattern to continue. What made the situation even more twisted was how the master rationalized it. In his mind, whatever happened within his property was his business alone. Whether the children were his or his brother's mattered less than the fact that they increased his wealth. Bloodlines, morality, and consent were irrelevant compared to profit and power. The brother's actions were inconvenient, not unforgivable. As years went by and more children were born, all bearing the same unmistakable resemblance, the household became a place of quiet paranoia. Servants whispered behind closed doors. The mistress grew distant and cold. The brother came and went more frequently, sometimes disappearing for months, only to return without explanation. The master grew harsher, more volatile, as if trying to crush the truth through force alone. For the enslaved woman, the master's household was no longer just a place of labor. It was the center of her suffering. It was where decisions about her body were made without her presence, where her children's futures were decided before they could speak, and where the resemblance that no one could erase became a living reminder of how deeply power had corrupted everything. The household stood intact on the outside, but inside it was already rotting, held together by silence, fear, and a secret so obvious that pretending it didn't exist became its own form of violence. The first child changed everything, even before anyone was willing to admit it. When the labor pains began, there was no urgency in the big house, no rush to ensure her safety. Childbirth among enslaved women was treated as routine, something expected and endured rather than cared for. She gave birth in a small, dim space, surrounded by quiet instructions and unspoken fear. When the baby finally arrived, the room fell unnaturally still. It wasn't the silence that follows exhaustion. It was the kind that comes when something is instantly understood, but not yet spoken. At first glance, the child appeared healthy. Strong lungs, steady breathing, a full head of dark hair. That alone would have been considered a success by plantation standards. But as the baby was cleaned and placed in the midwife's arms, something unsettling emerged. The shape of the nose, the set of the eyes, the curve of the mouth. These were not features that came from the mother. They belonged unmistakably to someone else. The older women in the room exchanged brief, frightened looks. They had seen many children born into slavery, many shades and features, but this was different. This was too specific, too familiar. When the master was informed, he came to see the child himself. He stood over the newborn in silence, studying the face longer than necessary. He didn't need confirmation. The resemblance was undeniable. The baby looked not like him, but like his brother. The same sharp cheekbones, the same brow, the same unsettling expression, even in infancy. In that moment, the master understood that something deeply dangerous had surfaced, not because of morality or wrongdoing, but because the truth had become visible. No one spoke. The enslaved woman lay exhausted, barely conscious, unaware of the storm already forming around her. The master said nothing before leaving the room, but his reaction was noted. His jaw tightened. His eyes hardened. This was not surprise, it was calculation. From that moment on, the child became a liability that had to be managed. The brother's reaction was entirely different. When he saw the child, he smiled. Not openly, not proudly, but with a quiet satisfaction that made those present uncomfortable. There was recognition in his gaze, a sense of possession. He lingered longer than was appropriate, watching the baby sleep, studying the tiny features as if confirming what he already knew. No one stopped him. No one could. Within days, whispers began spreading through the enslaved quarters. The resemblance was discussed quietly, in fragments, always with caution. People lowered their voices, spoke in half sentences. Everyone understood the danger of knowing too much. But knowledge has a way of moving faster than fear. The baby became known not by name, but by implication. The child who looked wrong. The child who carried a truth no one wanted exposed. The master moved quickly to contain the situation. The child was kept away from visitors. The mother was ordered to remain out of sight more often. Any enslaved person who mentioned the child's appearance was punished severely, even if the comment was harmless. The message was clear: this subject was forbidden. Silence was mandatory, but silence couldn't erase what eyes could plainly see. As the baby grew, the resemblance only became stronger. Each month brought more confirmation. The child's expressions mirrored the brother's in ways that felt uncanny. Even the way the child frowned, the way the eyes narrowed in concentration, seemed copied from another face entirely. Those who worked closely in the house found it impossible not to notice. For the enslaved woman, the realization came slowly and painfully. At first, she saw only her child's small, fragile hers. But as the baby grew, she began to see it too. The features that did not belong to her. The face that reminded her of nights she wished she could forget. Understanding dawned not as anger, but as dread. She knew what resemblance meant in a world where power dictated truth. It meant danger. It meant her child would never be safe. She tried to protect the baby in the only ways she could, keeping the child close, avoiding attention, whispering prayers at night. But protection was an illusion. The child did not belong to her in any meaningful way. Ownership, even over her own offspring, was denied to her completely. The master's wife noticed as well. She said nothing, but her behavior changed. She stopped asking after the baby. She avoided the enslaved woman's presence. When she did see the child, her face tightened with something between suspicion and quiet horror. In a household built on denial, this was the first crack in the facade. The brother grew bolder. He no longer avoided the nursery. He commented casually on the child's strength, the shape of the face, even the eyes. His remarks were framed as observation, but the meaning behind them was unmistakable. It was a reminder that he felt untouchable, and he was right. The first child set a precedent that could not be undone. It proved that what had happened once could happen again. It established a pattern before anyone realized they were trapped inside it. And perhaps most disturbingly, it showed that even undeniable truth meant nothing when power refused to acknowledge it. That baby was not just a child, it was evidence. Living, breathing proof of abuse that everyone saw and no one named. And from the moment that resemblance was noticed, the enslaved woman's fate was sealed. What began with one child would not end there. The silence that followed the birth was not an attempt to forget. It was an agreement to allow it to happen again and again, no matter the cost. After the first child, there was no pause, no moment where anyone questioned whether it should continue. The pattern didn't begin loudly or dramatically. It settled in quietly, like something already decided long before it happened again. Her body was given barely enough time to recover before the cycle resumed. On the plantation, repeated pregnancies were not seen as cruelty, they were seen as efficiency. Each birth was measured in future labor, future profit, future control. Her pain, her exhaustion, her will, none of it mattered. What made this different from other enslaved women forced into childbirth was the unspoken certainty surrounding her. She was no longer just a woman who could bear children. She had become a solution to a problem no one wanted exposed. Each pregnancy reinforced silence. Each birth reinforced complicity. The master allowed it because confronting it would mean acknowledging what he had already chosen to ignore. The brother continued because nothing stopped him. And the system itself made sure she had nowhere to turn. The pregnancies came one after another, blurring into a single, endless stretch of physical strain. There were no years between births, sometimes not even full seasons. Her body grew weaker, thinner, marked by scars that never healed properly. She learned to recognize the signs early: fatigue that sank into her bones, nausea that never left, a heaviness that settled in her stomach like a sentence being carried out. Each time, she knew exactly what it meant, and each time, she had no power to change it. The other enslaved women watched in quiet horror. They helped her when they could, hiding food, taking over small tasks when her strength failed, pressing cool cloths against her forehead during fevers. They whispered prayers over her swollen belly at night, not because they believed it would stop what was happening, but because prayer was the only resistance left to them. None of them needed explanations. They saw the pattern. They saw the resemblance repeating itself, and they understood that the more children she bore, the deeper the household sank into a secret that would never be spoken aloud. As the number of children grew, so did the effort to control appearances. Some babies were removed almost immediately, sent away before they could be seen by too many eyes. Others were kept briefly, then sold quietly to distant plantations. Records were altered, dates were adjusted, names disappeared. The goal was not just profit, it was distance. Distance from questions, distance from recognition, distance from the truth that was becoming harder to hide with each birth. For her, the emotional toll was as devastating as the physical one. Each child she carried was a life she knew she would not be allowed to keep. She felt them move inside her, felt their weight, their presence, and still had to prepare herself for the moment they would be taken. Loving them became an act of pain she endured anyway. She memorized their faces, their tiny expressions, knowing that memory might be all she would ever be allowed. Some were taken before they could speak. Others were old enough to cry for her as they were carried away. Those cries stayed with her long after the sound faded. The brother's behavior never softened. If anything, it became more careless. The repeated births confirmed what he already believed, that the rules did not apply to him. He moved through the household with confidence, rarely hiding his interest, rarely fearing consequence. The master responded not by stopping him, but by tightening his grip on everyone else. Punishments became harsher. Surveillance increased. Silence was enforced through fear. The master's wife withdrew almost entirely. She avoided the enslaved woman, avoided the children, avoided anything that might force her to confront the reality unfolding in her own home. Her withdrawal was not innocence. It was survival within a system that punished women who acknowledged too much. The household learned to operate around the truth rather than face it. By the time the count reached numbers that shocked even those accustomed to brutality, the enslaved woman herself had changed. Her movements were slower. Her eyes were distant. There was a kind of numbness in her, not from acceptance, but from exhaustion beyond despair. She no longer asked questions. She no longer hoped for interruption. Hope had become dangerous. Expectation had become painful. Each new pregnancy was treated as routine by those in power, but among the enslaved community, it was mourned quietly. They knew what it meant, not just another child, but another piece of her being consumed. Another reminder that her body was not her own. Another step deeper into a story no one could safely tell. The repetition itself became the cruelty, not a single act, but the endless return of it, the knowledge that it would happen again, and again, and again. That there would be no end until her body could no longer endure it. In a system designed to extract everything from a person, her repeated pregnancies were not a failure of humanity, they were its deliberate absence. And yet, through all of it, she remained alive, breathing, enduring. Not because she was allowed to choose survival, but because survival was forced upon her as thoroughly as everything else. Her existence became a record written into flesh rather than paper, a living account of power abused so consistently that it became invisible to those who benefited from it. By the time people began whispering about the number of children, the damage was already done. The pattern had long been established, normalized, protected. What had started with one child had become a relentless cycle that consumed decades of her life. And each birth wasn't just another tragedy. It was proof that silence, once chosen, only grows heavier with time. By the time the final children were born, the plantation no longer felt like a place anchored in time. It existed in a strange suspension, shaped by years of accumulated silence and unresolved guilt. Those who had witnessed the beginning were old or gone. New faces had arrived who knew only fragments of the story, yet even they sensed that something was wrong. The truth lingered in the air, unspoken but heavy, passed down not through words but through caution, where not to look, what not to ask, whom not to mention. The enslaved woman herself had become almost ghost-like in the eyes of the household. She was still alive, still moving, still breathing. But the years had hollowed her in ways that no one with power chose to notice. Her body bore the record of what had been done to her, pain layered upon pain, loss upon loss. Yet what remained strongest was not weakness but endurance. Survival had become her final, unwanted role. She survived not because anyone wished her well, but because her survival served as proof that the system could continue without consequence. As the children were scattered, sold, sent away, absorbed into distant labor, the plantation attempted to erase the pattern it had created. Names disappeared from ledgers. Births were recorded vaguely or not at all. The resemblance that once caused fear became less visible as distance did its work. Time, it was hoped, would finish what silence had begun. But memory does not obey orders, and some things resist being erased. Among the enslaved community, her story never vanished. It was told quietly, carefully, reshaped into something that could survive without getting anyone killed. Not all details were spoken, but the truth remained intact at its core. She became a symbol, not of shame, but of what unchecked power does when no one challenges it. The children she bore were remembered not by number alone, but by the pain that accompanied each birth and the injustice that followed each separation. The master aged into bitterness. Whatever control he believed he had maintained came at a cost. His household never truly recovered its sense of order. Trust had eroded. Fear had replaced loyalty. The brother eventually disappeared from the plantation entirely, leaving behind no explanation, no apology, no accountability. His absence did not undo the damage. It only confirmed what everyone already knew. That men like him could take everything and still walk away untouched. The master's wife lived out her years in quiet withdrawal. Whether she ever fully confronted the truth remains unknown. In a world that demanded women protect reputations at the cost of reality, her silence became part of the structure that allowed everything else to happen. She did not cause the abuse, but she lived within it, and that distinction offered little comfort to those who suffered because of it. As for the enslaved woman, there was no resolution, no moment of justice waiting at the end. There was only survival, stretched thin across decades. Her later years were marked by physical pain and emotional distance, yet also by something unexpected, a quiet authority among those who knew her story. Younger women listened when she spoke, not because she claimed wisdom, but because her existence itself was testimony. She had endured what should have destroyed her many times over. The legacy of her children was scattered across places she would never see. Some survived, some did not. Some may never have known where they came from or why their faces carried echoes of men they would never meet. The truth of their origins was buried under ownership papers and false records, but blood does not forget as easily as documents do. Even generations later, resemblance has a way of resurfacing, unsettling narratives that were meant to stay intact. What makes her story so unsettling is not only the number of children or the cruelty of the acts committed against her. It is the fact that none of it required secrecy to occur, only permission. Permission granted by law, by culture, by silence, by people who chose comfort over confrontation. Her life exposes how systems of power do not need monsters to function. They only need ordinary people willing to look away. In the end, her story was never about scandal or shock. It was about ownership taken to its furthest extreme, about a woman reduced to function, then blamed for the consequences of what was done to her, about children treated as evidence to be hidden rather than lives to be protected, and about a truth so obvious that denying it became an act of violence all its own. She was not remembered in monuments or records. There were no markers for her suffering, no official acknowledgement of what she endured. But her story survived because it had to, because forgetting it would mean accepting that such things could happen without meaning, and because, in remembering her, not just the horror, but the endurance, we confront the uncomfortable reality that history is shaped as much by what was allowed as by what was resisted. Her life stands as a reminder that survival under oppression is not consent, that silence is not innocence, and that some truths, no matter how deeply buried, continue to breathe through the people who carry them. Long after the last child was taken from her arms, the plantation carried the weight of what had happened in ways that were subtle but permanent. Nothing dramatic marked the change. No public reckoning, no confrontation, no sudden collapse of authority. Instead, the damage revealed itself slowly, in strained relationships, in unspoken rules, in a constant undercurrent of fear that never fully lifted. The household continued to function, but it no longer felt whole. Something essential had been broken, and everyone sensed it, even if they could not name it. Among the enslaved people, trust in the system, already fragile, had eroded almost completely. What had happened to her confirmed what many had long suspected, that there were no limits, no lines that could not be crossed when power went unchecked. Parents looked at their children differently, not with hope, but with calculation. How to protect them, how to keep them unseen, how to keep them alive. Mothers held their daughters closer. Fathers taught their sons silence early. Survival became less about strength and more about invisibility. Her presence, even in quiet moments, reminded others of what endurance really cost. She did not speak often about what she had suffered, but she didn't need to. Her body told the story. The way she moved carefully, conserving energy. The way she paused when she heard certain footsteps, even years later. Trauma lingered not as memory alone, but as instinct. Those who spent time near her learned to read these signs, and through them, they learned caution. The master's authority remained intact on paper, but it had lost something intangible: respect, even the kind built on fear. People obeyed because they had to, not because they believed in his control. Orders were followed, but loyalty had evaporated. He sensed this shift and responded with increased harshness, mistaking fear for obedience. In doing so, he only deepened the divide. A plantation cannot function on cruelty alone without consequences, and those consequences often arrive quietly. The brother's disappearance left unanswered questions that lingered like an open wound. Some believed he left to avoid scrutiny. Others believed he was simply done, having taken what he wanted without consequence. His absence did not bring relief. If anything, it reinforced the truth that justice was never part of the equation. He left behind children he would never claim and damage he would never face. His vanishing became another lesson in how easily men with power could escape accountability. The mistress lived in a state of emotional exile within her own home. Her silence hardened into routine. She maintained appearances, hosted when necessary, smiled when expected, but those close to her noticed the emptiness behind it. Whether she felt guilt, denial, or helplessness no longer mattered. Her role in the aftermath was defined not by what she did, but by what she allowed to continue. In that world, permission often came not from action, but from refusal to intervene. As time passed, rumors escaped the plantation's boundaries despite efforts to contain them. Nearby plantations heard fragments. Numbers whispered without context. Resemblance mentioned cautiously. Children appearing and disappearing too quickly. Nothing solid enough to accuse. Nothing specific enough to confront. But enough to stain reputations quietly. In a society obsessed with honor, that kind of whisper carried weight. The master's standing weakened, not through exposure, but through suspicion that never fully went away. For the enslaved woman, the later years were marked by a strange duality. She was physically diminished, yet socially significant among her people. Younger women sought her out, not for comfort, but for understanding. She became someone who knew how far cruelty could go and still endured. She offered no false hope, no promises of safety. What she offered instead was honesty, about the world they lived in, about the dangers they faced, about the strength required simply to survive another day. Her children, scattered across distant places, became part of a wider, unseen legacy. Some may have lived long lives, never knowing the full truth of their origins. Others likely suffered fates shaped by the same system that had produced them. Their separation was not just personal loss, it was strategic erasure. By breaking families apart, the system ensured that stories could not be easily traced, that accountability dissolved across distance. Yet even erasure has limits. Bloodlines travel, resemblances resurface. Questions emerge generations later with no clear answers. History has a way of pushing back against attempts to bury it completely. The consequences of what happened did not end with her life, or even her children's lives. They rippled outward, shaping identities, destinies, and silences long after the original actors were gone. What makes the aftermath so disturbing is its normalcy. There was no moment where the world paused to acknowledge the harm done. Life simply continued, built atop suffering that was never addressed. That continuation is itself part of the violence. It shows how systems protect themselves not through denial alone, but through routine, by treating the unbearable as ordinary. In the end, Keynote 6 is not about a single event, but about the damage that lingers when injustice is allowed to stand unchallenged. It is about how a household, a community, and a generation were shaped by something everyone knew and no one stopped. And it is about how survival, while often celebrated, can also be evidence of how much cruelty a system is capable of inflicting and enduring without ever calling itself to account. What endured most powerfully after everything else had faded was not the plantation itself, nor the names of the men who controlled it, but the story that refused to die among the people who carried it forward. Even when details blurred with time, the core truth survived. It lived in warnings passed from older women to younger ones, in cautious advice spoken at night, in the way certain families remembered faces that looked too familiar for coincidence. The system tried to scatter the evidence, but memory adapted. It learned how to hide among the enslaved community and later among freed descendants. Her story transformed from a specific account into something broader and more protective. It was no longer just about one woman or one household. It became a lesson about power, about silence, about what happens when truth is dangerous to speak aloud. The facts were rarely told in full, not because they were forgotten, but because survival had taught people how much truth the world was willing to punish. So the story was shaped carefully, stripped of names, anchored instead in meaning. Children grew up hearing fragments, not enough to expose anyone, but enough to understand the rules. Don't trust appearances. Don't assume protection will come from authority. Don't believe that suffering always leaves visible marks. These lessons were not taught in schools or churches. They were taught through tone, through pauses, through the way elders fell quiet when certain subjects arose. Silence itself became a language, one that carried more information than open speech ever could. As generations passed, some descendants began noticing patterns they couldn't explain. Faces in old photographs that resembled strangers. Family traits that seemed to come from nowhere. Stories of ancestors sold away without record. The official histories offered nothing. Records were incomplete, altered, or lost. But the human instinct to understand where one comes from persisted. Questions surfaced quietly, often unanswered, but never entirely dismissed. In some cases, descendants on different sides of history unknowingly crossed paths. People who shared blood, but not acknowledgement. People whose lives were shaped by the same origin, separated by power and distance. The system that had once controlled everything had never anticipated this. How bloodlines ignore boundaries, how resemblance resists erasure. Even when truth is denied, it continues to exist in bodies, in faces, in inherited expressions. What made her legacy so complex was that it carried both pain and resilience. She was remembered not only for what was done to her, but for the fact that she endured it without surrendering entirely to despair. Survival, in her case, was not passive. It required constant adaptation, emotional compartmentalization, and an ability to keep living despite repeated loss. That endurance became a source of quiet strength for those who came after her. Yet there was also anger embedded in the memory. Not loud or explosive, but steady and unresolved. Anger at the men who walked away untouched. Anger at the laws that allowed it. Anger at the silence that protected power while isolating victims. This anger did not always express itself openly. Sometimes it became determination. Sometimes it became skepticism of authority. Sometimes it became a deep mistrust of narratives that claimed history was orderly or just. As the world changed and slavery officially ended, the story did not suddenly become safe to tell. Freedom did not erase fear. For many, speaking openly still carried risks, social, economic, physical. So the story continued its quiet transmission, waiting for a time when it might finally be heard without consequence. Each generation carried it a little differently, adding context, subtracting danger, but preserving its truth. In later years, when historians and storytellers began looking more closely at the lived experiences behind official records, stories like hers began to surface, not always with documentation, but with consistency. Similar patterns, similar silences, similar efforts to erase evidence while failing to erase memory. Her story was no longer an isolated horror. It became part of a larger understanding of how widespread and normalized such abuse had been. What gives Keynote 7 its weight is this persistence, the refusal of truth to disappear simply because it was inconvenient, the way stories survive oppression by becoming flexible rather than fragile. Her legacy was not carved in stone or written in law. It was carried in people, and people remember in ways institutions cannot control. Even today, her story challenges how history is told. It forces a reckoning with the gap between official narratives and lived reality. It asks uncomfortable questions about whose stories are preserved and whose are buried. And it reminds us that the past is not finished simply because time has passed. It continues to shape identities, relationships, and understanding in ways that are often invisible but deeply felt. In the end, Keynote 7 is about inheritance, not of land or wealth, but of truth. A truth carried through silence, protected by caution, and preserved by those who understood that remembering was itself an act of resistance. Her life did not end in recognition or justice, but it did not end in erasure either. And that endurance, passed from one generation to the next, ensured that what was done to her would not be completely lost to history, no matter how hard it was hidden. Even as the years passed and the plantation continued its routines, the psychological and physical toll on the enslaved woman became increasingly evident. Her body, once resilient, had been pushed beyond its natural limits. Every pregnancy left marks that never healed fully, aching joints, persistent fatigue, and a constant reminder of the forced labor that never ceased. Her strength became a mixture of endurance and silent suffering. She carried her trauma in ways the household could not see, but that shaped every movement, every glance, every word she spoke. Each step she took was a testament to a life stretched thin by cruelty, yet sustained by sheer will. The emotional impact was even more profound. Every child taken from her arms represented a fracture in her heart, a constant reminder that motherhood had been weaponized against her. She had no choice in these separations. There was no comfort in knowing that some of her children might survive elsewhere. Her role as a mother had been reduced to an instrument for the plantation's control. Grief became a permanent companion, mingled with fear, anger, and a deep-seated helplessness that never fully dissipated. The loss of agency over her own body and her offspring was a trauma that reverberated through every aspect of her life. Within the enslaved community, her suffering became a silent lesson. Others watched, learned, and adapted, understanding the consequences of speaking up or resisting. While outwardly she appeared to survive without complaint, her experience communicated the limits imposed on anyone daring to challenge the power structure. The young women who observed her learned to mask fear, to endure quietly, and to navigate a world where safety was measured by invisibility and submission. Her endurance became both a warning and a guide. The repeated pregnancies also affected her relationship with her own children in subtle, heartbreaking ways. The bonds she could form were fleeting, often interrupted by forced separation or the constant anticipation of the next child. Love became a dangerous vulnerability. She learned to temper her affection, to compartmentalize grief, and to steel herself for repeated heartbreak. Yet, despite this, she could not stop caring. Her maternal instinct persisted, intertwining hope and despair in a cycle she could neither escape nor control. Even within the household, the psychological effects of her situation were apparent, though rarely acknowledged. The master, the brother, and even the mistress understood, at some level, that her endurance was not normal, yet they treated it as routine. They measured her capacity to bear children and perform labor, as if she were a machine, ignoring the human cost entirely. Their perception of her suffering as inconsequential reinforced the violence of the system and deepened the isolation she experienced. Every cry, every pang, every quiet tear became invisible to those who should have protected her, and this invisibility compounded the psychological toll. Medical understanding at the time offered no recourse. Any attempts to intervene, whether by plantation doctors or midwives, were framed within the context of utility rather than compassion. Health concerns were addressed only insofar as they ensured the next pregnancy or labor could proceed. There was no acknowledgement of her pain as legitimate beyond its impact on productivity. This lack of medical and emotional care magnified the suffering, leaving her to navigate life with a body and mind taxed beyond normal human endurance. The repetition of these traumatic experiences created a kind of learned resilience, a survival mechanism that required constant vigilance. She had to manage her own body, her environment, and her relationships within the constraints imposed on her. Every action was calculated to avoid punishment, every word considered for its potential consequences. The stress of this vigilance contributed to a continuous state of psychological strain, yet it also preserved her life. Adaptation became survival, and survival became resistance in its quietest form. Later in life, the long-term consequences of these forced pregnancies became undeniable. Chronic pain, fatigue, and emotional scars persisted even when the cycle of childbearing slowed. Memories of loss, fear, and control lingered like shadows, shaping her understanding of the world and the people in it. She became acutely aware of the fragility of life under oppression, and this awareness informed the way she interacted with others, her children, and the younger members of the enslaved community. She carried lessons learned through suffering, imparting them in subtle ways that spoke more powerfully than words. The physical and emotional toll was inseparable from her identity. She was marked by endurance, resilience, and trauma simultaneously. Her body and mind were testimony to the extremes of human cruelty and the capacity to survive it. Her story illustrates the intimate cost of systemic oppression, showing how repeated violations of body and spirit ripple outward, affecting not just the individual, but the wider community. Every pregnancy, every separation, every forced act left echoes that could not be erased. Ultimately, Keynote 8 highlights that the physical and emotional suffering she endured was not incidental. It was the mechanism by which the plantation maintained control, manipulated lineage, and asserted power. Her endurance became a living record of what systemic abuse can do to the human body and spirit. It also served as a quiet defiance, a reminder that even under unbearable conditions, the capacity to survive, to resist in subtle ways, and to bear witness to injustice can persist, leaving a legacy that outlives oppression itself.